for a reason. So, you know, just as you would approach your state elected officials for state questions, you know, if things function the way they're supposed to, your congressman and senator.
If the federal government wants to promote wind, then they should allow it.
Well, and sometimes it takes more than an agency, no matter whether it's federal or state or even local, to make certain decisions. Sometimes the decision has to come from the legislature at that level. And I realize that that's a big arena we're talking about, but I know on many issues your locally elected federal legislator can offer suggestions and can perhaps be aware of, if your view is that there needs to be legislation to change certain policies, that's at least a place to start.
Okay, thanks.
I wouldn't stop at the federal officials. Actually, on the offshore situation, it took letters and meetings of 9 or 10 governors, state officials, to meet with Ken Salazar, who's the head of the Department of the Interior, who's responsible for the offshore wind, and they were successful in getting the process to certify or approve leases for lands on federal lands or federal waters from what was being told by the bureaucrats to be a 5 to 7 year process. We're now looking at 1 to 2 years maybe. So, you know, getting the state officials and getting maybe a critical mass of them, you know, maybe working with other states to try to get that done.
Okay. I was just a little concerned with offshore. I know Jay, I can't remember his last name, he's the AEP Renewable Energy Director at the JMU Wind Symposium. He told me that AEP would never go offshore because it costs twice as much to install and twice as much to service. So that's why they were looking more at the bridge tops and things like that.
Yeah, actually, Mark, that is one of the key drivers for the Department of Energy right now is to bring the cost down. And I think the benchmark everyone being both the federal and the state side is looking at is trying to reach a 30 cent per kilowatt hour goal.
Could you say that again? I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think the Department of Energy has made it very clear that if there's one driver in terms of how it's going to fund research and development, it's going to be in terms of efforts that bring the costs down for installing offshore wind.
And what was the cost?
And the benchmark I've heard is 13 cents per kilowatt hour. I think the consensus both between the federal government and the states is that's where offshore becomes competitive and part of the broader equation.
Well, they get rid of the transmissions. And that's what,
you know, I think that really gets toward an interesting question to which I know Bruce has some significant experience. You know, how can you get to 13 cents for offshore if it's acknowledged by some factor it's more expensive than onshore? And you not only do you have construction challenges and costs in terms of the fleet, the boats you have to use, and constructing on water, but you also have some significant insurance challenges. Some in some places more so than others, depending on what your relationship is to typical tracts of hurricanes. But that's all just to say that, you know, when we look at offshore, I mean, we currently see it as, you know, very expensive, worth working towards. But right now, we spend more of our time onshore, and that's primarily economically driven. I think that it's important to consider, you know, the advantages of offshore. Certainly the resource is huge, and we look toward the future and consider, are we going to put those same resources into, you know, coal or nuclear, and we think about the externalized cost with some of those resources. You know, I think it's fair to consider, you know, as a society, to what extent those externalized costs, you know, cost us somewhere. And so, you know, when you think of 13 cents and how to get there, you know, as advocates, I think you have to think about the externalized cost elsewhere when you think of the 13 cents. And I think realistically, either the federal government in some way or state governments, maybe in the form of amending the RPS somehow in Virginia's case, or allowing for cost recovery, or having a feed-in tariff type program. I think something would need to change for offshore wind in certain places to become more competitive with onshore wind.
Is it 6 to 7 cents onshore, right?
A little higher.
Well, it could be a little higher, but yeah, and the cost recovery, I hate to take this opportunity to sort of kick one back to Bruce, but I mean, Bruce, I think Bruce knows a lot about, cost recovery, has studied it a lot, and that likely is a significant question for the developers and the utilities in the given area.
Yeah, it's a huge question, cost recovery. I mean, you just can't, offshore especially, I mean, you're talking about projects that are, in a lot of cases, the one in Delaware is going to be $1,200,000,000. They're not going to go use their own money to develop a project like that. They're going to go and get financing for that. So they need cost recovery. They need a purchase power agreement that says that the ratepayers in Delaware are going to foot the cost of that, assuming that the project gets done and energy is flowing. So cost recovery, but it also applies to the onshore as well. I mean, they have the same issues, maybe not to the degree from a dollar point of view, but they need to get their projects financed as well. And to have a 10, 15, 20-year contract that they know is going to be paid for because the utilities can get the rates from the ratepayers, then they can get those things financed in many cases. So that's certainly the way to look at it. Offshore is just there's certainly, you have to realize with offshore wind that the fact is we have very high, the one nice thing about the Mid-Atlantic region, they're very high aggressive RPS standards. You go to some other parts of the country, they don't have some. Again, there's only 29 states that have mandatory. You go to other parts of the country and they're relatively small RPS or with a lot of outs. You go to Virginia and it's a voluntary one. But there's a lot of renewables. It's not just going to be wind, but wind's going to be predominant because of the price, onshore wind. But it's not going to be enough. It's not going to be enough. So I raised the question in my presentation about, are you going to get it from the Midwest? Are you going to get it from PJM region, this region, or are you going to get it from offshore? Well, probably the answer is you're going to get a little bit from the Midwest. You're going to get hopefully a lot from onshore in PJM, but there's still going to be some left over. You're going to need offshore wind, and there's a huge lead time with offshore wind. So we're talking 5, 6, 7 years away before some of these projects can get built, and so you can't ignore it, and it's something that needs to be worked on, and it's something that's important to this region especially.
I wanted to come back to onshore
Yeah.
and kind of down back to the mundane. I mean, the reality on the ground here is you need 3 votes in the Planning Commission and 3 votes in the County Board of Supervisors. And the thing that's been striking to me in this process is the level of ignorance of the state of Virginia about wind power because we don't have it. And so we find ourselves in a situation where groups like the Tea Party are doing a very good job of campaigning in a very organized manner, so that even state legislators that we would expect to be very friendly to wind start right off with the Tea Party's talking points when we speak with them. And just to read one paragraph from what was in the op-ed yesterday that perhaps many of you saw here in Rona, the fact that the proposed location on Horn Mountain is the highest point around is irrelevant, because during the very few hours per year, not days, few hours per year, that there is theoretically enough wind velocity to generate power, the airflow will be so turbulent that the turbines will operate at a greatly reduced efficiency. I mean, it's monumental ignorance that we're having to deal with, and I guess I'm wondering what the panelists, and part of the problem is we come at it from an environmental standpoint, not a technical one. Who's going to speak to the technical reality?
It's a great
You
question.
see the lot of facts pulled out of the air, and it's very hard to respond to a fact. Like, I think the question is, where's their proof? You know, show us some. I mean, I know you're talking to legislators who might have picked up on this, but you know, come in with the facts. I mean, you just can't come in and.
We have facts, I'm
Yeah.
saying.
They
it's
make
not
up
really
stuff.
Yeah, I
They
mean-
have to have the facts.
It's
We've
not
seen this in
really
the
our
political
role
discourse
to
in our
respond to
country,
these
too.
technical issues. I'm really asking, who's gonna make the case technically for this?
You know, I think it's a very good question. I mean, in practice, you know, I think the developer tries to address the technical questions as they arise, you know, whether directly through a response to the paper or meeting with the editorial board, things of that sort. I think the reality that Diana knows and that I do is if you're in a county of, say, 6,000 people, and you know, maybe there's a real small, locally distributed newspaper, you know, there may be an article here and there about things going on, but this particular community, pretty established media, all the networks, and a big paper with good distribution, and so essentially they don't really weed out anything that comes in, and so it doesn't really matter. It's going to get printed, and I think from a perspective of a developer that has seen incredible work done in the business community and by environmental groups and health organizations, that it's at times it's not practical for me, you know, or Invenergy to keep up with every scheme that's sort of hatched through the newspaper from somebody. You do the best you can, but long and short is there's not a well, and I should say I also noticed that at least one occasion that OEA addressed one of these pieces, and so there are entities and people there to work and on those issues, but sometimes the groundswell, or I don't think I should even say groundswell, just sometimes the frequency of some of these things that come to the paper is difficult to keep up with from a developer's perspective.
And I can speak to that because that's partly, I think, our responsibility. Really, that's part of the reason why we were chosen, I think, to lead Mid-Atlantic Wind Energy Institute, is because in Pennsylvania, that's exactly what we did. In the mid-2000s, when we were working on wind, at first there was a lot of high-level stuff, was policy, was working with the industry. And then we saw this misinformation being spread around all over our state, and we realized that, you know, as hard as we tried to respond to all of it, it was quite a task. So part of the reason that we started the wind retreats, kind of similar to this, was to help train the folks out there in those communities to respond to that themselves, and hopefully provide them with the resources and maybe even connections to the experts that would allow them to counter those arguments. So that's hopefully what we're trying to foster here, and we hope to be that resource down the line.
I hope the wind industry doesn't feel singled out because those issues and that misinformation transcends the development of wind energy. It affects other types of development that can be seen as positive, but certainly negative by the naysayers as well.
It's usually the same.
The thing that